All right, welcome back to the first trade. There's a big divide this morning over NASCAR's decision to ban the Confederate flag from its races. And while many are cheering the move, overnight a NASCAR Truck Series driver said he's leaving the sport over what he called, quote, political BS. Yahoo Finance senior columnist Rick Newman joins us now, along with our very own editor-at-large, Dan Roberts. Good to see all of you guys this morning. Dan, let me start with you. There are some big sponsors in NASCAR, as you know all too well. What has taken them so long, and why haven't they stepped up and mentioned anything about removing the Confederate flag?
Yeah, it's interesting, Sozzi. I mean, we know that these companies are hesitant to speak out unless they're forced to, pressured to. I wouldn't be surprised if we start to see the sponsors get pressure, but so far it's really been about the sport, and this change has happened at the top level of the sport, and it's all thanks to Bubba Wallace. So some say, look, I can't believe it took this long, it took this many years, it took the only black driver in the sport calling for change. But let's make sure that viewers understand here, it's not that the sport was ever, sanctioning this or putting up the flags themselves. It's something fans do. Fans come and they park and they sit in the stands and they wave Confederate flags, or many of them are driving RVs, and the RVs have Confederate flags. But it's always been something that is very, very pervasive in the sport. And finally, Bubba Wallace used this time and this moment in America to call it out and say it should be banned. And the sport responded, and NASCAR said, okay, we're banning it. So good that this change has happened. It took a long time, though, and maybe some people won't like it. Some fans are probably going to complain. You might see some of the response that we saw to the NFL kneeling at first, but I think overall this is being applauded. A good change that was a long time coming.
Hey, Rick, when you look at some of the partner companies, this is major money here. Coca-Cola, Geico, which, by the way, is owned by Berkshire Hathaway, AB InBev, are all sponsors in the NASCAR sport. If they didn't do this, what kind of pressure would those companies have been under to stay in the sport?
I mean, obviously, we're at a moment where the zeitgeist is changing, and if NASCAR was smart, they had a contingency plan for something like this, so that they knew if we ever start to get flack about the Confederate flag, we're going to have to execute Plan C or D or whatever it is, Plan Confederate. It would have been a no-brainer. The sponsors would have had to pull out, and NASCAR smartly avoided a confrontation with its sponsors and its advertisers. I think it's actually going to be kind of hard to police, though, because as Dan points out, you can have thousands of fans, basically tailgating for days or sometimes for an entire weekend. I'm just kind of wondering, are they going to have security guards wandering around telling people to put their flags away? I think you're going to have some people deliberately trying to violate this new rule by flying their flags. So, will it rise to the level of confrontation at NASCAR events? I don't know. I think they're going to have something of a hard time, though, enforcing this.
Well, it's interesting, guys. Rick, if I had to guess, I think they'll probably not allow people to drive into the parking areas if there's any Confederate flag. But you're right. They'll have to police it. They'll probably have people in the parking lots at tailgates walking around looking for them. And I'm sure there will be people who try to push it. Now, one more note on the sponsors. You guys are asking about, whether they would have been pushed to respond. I think if NASCAR hadn't taken action, then you would have seen a big social media campaign to pressure sponsors to comment. And if I'm those corporate sponsors, I'm relieved now because they don't have to comment. The sport went ahead and acted. And certainly they're not going to comment and go against the sport. The difference with, the NFL 4 years ago when the protests were happening and all the sponsors were being pressured to say something, it's because the NFL didn't really take a clear stance. It didn't, outright stop players from doing it, but, in some cases it said they would be penalized. And so because they sat on the fence, sponsors were being pressured. Well, what side do you come out on? Here, the debate is over. The sport acted quickly and said we're banning the flags. So the sponsors aren't going to really be forced to comment like they would have been.
To sort of think about this, go back a couple of years to when this was a big deal with the NFL. The other factor back then, which you and I both wrote and talked about, Dan, was Donald Trump. The NFL was in a shoving match with the president of the United States, who was obviously taking a stand against kneeling and, quote, in favor of the flag, although that's a false kind of a false choice. It makes you wonder if there's any chance Trump will get involved in the NASCAR debate, because he has, with regard to the Army bases named after Confederate generals, I think just yesterday, he did take a stand on that. Seems crazy politically, but not out of the realm of possibility that Trump could get involved in this and criticize NASCAR for banning showing to the Confederate flag.
I think very likely, Rick. I fully expect a Trump tweet as the noise about this story gets louder.